I could just have everybody's attention again, and we will start for what will be an absolutely amazing morning, I'm very sure. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Kerferd, I'm Jude Doughty, and I welcome you to the 14th George Briscoe Kerferd Oration. I consider it to be a very great privilege to again be part of the 14th Kerferd Oration, dedicated this morning to considering the art of belonging. Our distinguished orator, Hugh Mackay, suggests that a good life is not about where we live, but how we live. He argues that for the past 50 years, we've been led to believe that there is nothing more important, and I quote Hugh, than my material comforts, my personal happiness, my well-being, my rights, and my entitlements. However, Hugh says that really the most interesting question is not who am I, but who are we, and what kind of society do we want to create? Today we have all chosen to spend this Sunday morning at the 14th Kerferd Oration thinking about what kind of community we want for the Indigo Shire, and to better understand how each one of us can feel that we belong to the community. We thank you all for being here this morning and consider that every single one of you present is a very special guest. I would, however, like to make particular mention of our orator, Hugh Mackay, AO, past orators, Cathy McGowan, AO, MP, and Federal Member for Indi, and Bill Wilson, APM, OAM. Our sponsor representatives from La Trobe University, Mark Engel, WAW Credit Union, Richard Power, and Indigo Shire councillors, Mayor James Trenery, Deputy Mayor Peter Croucher, councillors Jenny O'Connor, Barb Murdoch, Roberta Horn, and Indigo Shire Chief Executive Jerry Smith. And of course the descendants of George Briscoe Kerferd, who I will say a little more about later. Apologies have also been received from a number of community leaders across our region. You will have all read the notes in the program that outlines Hugh Mackay's extraordinary contribution to public debate as an author and social researcher, both in Australia and internationally. Please welcome Hugh Mackay, AO, to deliver the 14th George Briscoe Kerferd Oration.
Thank you very much, Jude, and thank you, and good morning, everybody. I must say it's a very great pleasure to be back in beautiful Beechworth, where I've spent many pleasant holidays in the past. Never anything as formal as this. And of course it's a great honour to be invited to deliver this oration, which honours the remarkable legacy of George Kerferd. I'm sure you must be as tired as I am of being told how selfish we all are, we humans. It's become a very popular view, advanced by some very eminent biologists, that human beings are by nature selfish. That the main thing you need to know about us is that we're always looking out for number one. We've always got our own personal well-being at the centre of our minds, and that even when it appears as if we're behaving selflessly or altruistically, actually that's just to make us feel better about ourselves or to look good in the eyes of other people. Evolution, we're told, has decreed that we are so selfish that we are ruthlessly competitive and capable of being violent towards people who stand in the way of our personal ambition. Well, let me invite you at the beginning of this lecture to reflect on whether that's an accurate description of you. Just take a little look in the psychological mirror and ask yourself, am I that kind of person? And if you're honest, you'll probably say, well, occasionally I do remember moments when I was consumed by ambition, or when my personal goals were so important to me that they caused me to be insensitive or unkind to someone else. Of course, there's some truth in that view of humans, but there is a far deeper truth, and it's also the most noble and the sweetest truth about human beings, which is that we are, by our very nature, by our evolutionary destiny, we are social creatures. We feel often like individuals, but the truth about us is that as individuals we are hopeless. In isolation, we are pathetic. As humans, like so many other species on the planet, we need each other, and we need communities to support us and sustain us and to nurture us and to protect us. As social creatures, we were born to cooperate, not to compete. And in fact, neuroscientists who are now capable of peeping into the human brain and finding out all sorts of things that psychologists have previously just guessed at, can tell us now that they can find the cooperative centre in the brain. What they can't find is the competitive centre. Being competitive is something we learn. By the way, we learn it quite young and we learn it quite quickly, but the nature, the thing we're born with, the thing that's in our DNA, is the urge to cooperate for the very obvious reason that as a species we couldn't survive if we didn't have communities to support us, and communities couldn't survive if we were not prepared to cooperate with each other. If you doubt any of this, just take a look at how 99% of the world's population lives. We congregate in cities and suburbs and towns and villages. There are hermits. There are people who absolutely want to be alone and don't want to have anything to do with the rest of us, but of course you don't know any because they don't want to have anything to do with the rest of us. But every now and then, if they're in trouble, of course, they seek out a community for support. But hermits are 0.001% of the population. They're not characteristic of human. We are people who like to congregate. We like to live with each other. We like to join and to belong. And the beautiful symmetry of human nature is that while we need communities to support us, those communities need us to support them. The history of human civilization, including quite recent Australian history, demonstrates that there's nothing magical about communities. They don't just happen and they don't automatically survive. Communities die out all the time. I'm sure you know of villages not far from here that have effectively ceased to function as communities, and that's a story all around the world, all through history. Communities only survive when we nurture them. So it's not just sad, but it's also deeply serious when you hear people saying things like, "We don't know our neighbours," or "I feel like a bit of a stranger in my own street." Now, I was going to say this morning that you don't hear that sort of thing said in Beechworth, but I see in the program that Beechworth is organising a Neighbour Day later in the year to encourage people to make contact with their neighbours. So I'm guessing that even in Beechworth there are people who don't know their neighbours or who aren't engaged as neighbours with the people who live in close proximity to them. But if you move beyond communities like Beechworth, particularly into major metropolitan centres, you find statements like "we don't know our neighbours," or "we feel a bit like a stranger in our own street," or "the neighbourhood doesn't seem to be working like a community the way it used to." You hear that kind of thing said so often, it's almost become a cliche of urban life and increasingly of regional life, that it's too strong a message to ignore. As a social researcher, I can't hear people say that decade after decade with increasing frequency and just ignore it. I'm fascinated by it, concerned by it, and of course keen to know where this came from. If it's true, what are the factors that caused it to be true? And I think there are two big contributing factors to the breakdown of neighbourhoods and communities, not just in Australia, but around the Western world. And when I talk about these two factors, I want to emphasise that neither of them produces an inevitable outcome. It is by no means inevitable that communities would have to fragment or dislocate. These are pressures on communities, even like Beechworth, that we have to resist. We have to be conscious of the pressure so we know how to deal with it. The first of the two factors is the propaganda that has been bombarding Western society, and Australia is a good example, for at least the last 30 years. And it's propaganda that says it's all about me. This is what's produced what sociologists now describe as the me culture. And the propaganda has been coming from two different sources. One is the commercial mass marketing industry, which of course is always in the business of telling us that it's all about us, that our personal happiness, our personal well-being depends on how much stuff we can acquire, and that life is not rich or meaningful unless you've got the latest this or a second that. Well, we know materialism is a very hollow promise, but it's a very seductive promise, and commercial mass marketers are getting better and better at the seduction, courtesy most recently, of course, of their invasion on a large scale into social media as well as the conventional media. So we've got that coming at us all the time, saying you're entitled to all this stuff. It's not about how you can spend your money to improve the well-being of the community. It's about how you can spend your money to improve your own sense of material comfort and prosperity. That's one source of propaganda. The other source is a bit less obvious, but it's been coming at us from what I've come to think of as the happiness industry. The people who've been selling us, again for about the last quarter century, have been selling us the idea that the default position for human beings is to be happy. That if you're not happy, there's something wrong with you, so you better get happy. And if you're feeling miserable, that is a flaw that must be corrected. And we have various solutions to correct it. Go to the local bookshop or the library, and you'll find a couple of rows of books encouraging you to pursue personal happiness as though that's a suitable goal for a human life. And if the books don't do it for you, well, there are endless TED Talks on YouTube and elsewhere that you can tune into. There are conferences that you can attend on achieving personal happiness. Again, notice none of this is about the well-being of the community. This is all about me feeling terrific, even euphoric if possible. And if none of these strategies are working for you, well, there are pharmacological pathways to happiness, legal and illegal. We can produce this state of happiness that you say you want, or that we're encouraging you to want, by various drugs. Well, the argument is so stupid that I scarcely know where to begin in refuting it, and I gather from some of the laughter that I don't really have to bother refuting it because it's self-evidently stupid. But what it flies in the face of is the fact that one of the great blessings we have as humans is this full spectrum of emotions which equip us to deal with whatever life throws at us, and every point on that spectrum is authentic, is valid, is legitimate. And every point on that spectrum has something important to teach us about what it means to be human. And every point, no point on the spectrum would make any sense without all the others. So if I could today bestow on you permanent future happiness, the bad news is you would never be happy. Because you're only happy if you are sometimes sad. You have to have the contrasts. And happiness makes no sense without sadness. Success makes no sense without failure. And what most people over the age of about 12 will tell you is that the so-called dark emotions, sadness, failure, disappointment, loss, defeat, all of these things tend to be the most powerful teachers of what it means to be human. We learn far more from the dark stuff than we do from the bright, shiny stuff, yet here we are, seduced by the message that all that stuff is a fault, and if you're feeling miserable, don't stay with it and examine it and see why and what it has to teach you. Pop a pill or have another drink or come to one of our conferences and banish this. We see it's affecting not just the way we feel about ourselves, it's affecting the way we're raising our kids and even our grandchildren. We see a child who's got a tear in the eye and we say, come on, give us a smile, as though we're only interested in smiles around here, there's no room for tears. Why? When we know from life's experience that the tears are a very powerful teacher. So this is a weird situation we've got ourselves into. I think it's one of the things that's contributed to our epidemics of anxiety and depression. The fact that so many people now have the expectation that they should be up all the time, that all outcomes should be positive, that we should be cheerful and feel deeply content, and that if we don't, that means there's something wrong with us. What a terrible message to send to a culture, but we've been sending it and receiving it for 2 or 3 decades. So put that together with the pressures of commercial mass marketing, and you can see why, as a community, we have been rather persuaded to think that it's all about me, that I should be looking after number one, that my wealth and my happiness are the top agenda items for me. The other source of the other factor that's contributed to this potential for fragmentation of communities, though, is not just a mental process like the one or an emotional process like the one I've been describing. It's what's been happening in our society. And again, we're typical of Western societies. This is not an Australian exclusive. But if you look at what's been happening in Australia over the last 30 years or so, you're looking at a society that's been through so many significant upheavals, so many social, cultural, economic, technological revolutions all at once, that the tendency is for these changes not just to distress us, and this is another contributor to our epidemic of anxiety. Why can't things stand still? Why does everything have to change so fast? Why can't life be the way I thought it was going to be? That promotes anxiety. But also, when you look at the sort of things that have been changing in our society, you realise that the cumulative effect of them is likely to fragment us. Most of the changes that we now recognise as reshaping Australia and Western cultures like ours, most of them are about breaking down families, neighbourhoods, communities, even workplaces, and what the sociologists call atomising societies so that we think of ourselves more as individuals than as members. Well, that all sounds a bit theoretical. Let me quickly run through a few of the big social changes, social, economic, technological changes that have been reshaping Australia, and you can begin to see why they've exerted the kind of pressure they've exerted. Let's start with marriage. I should say in one breath, marriage and divorce, because in the last 40 years we've moved from being one of the world's low divorce societies to among the world's high divorce societies, with an estimated 40% of contemporary marriages likely to end in divorce. 40%. That's in sharp contrast with how it was 40 years ago, when only about 8 or 9% of Australian marriages ever ended in divorce. Well, when you live in a society in which divorce is no longer stigmatised, of course, but it's actually commonplace, where I think only in the current year only 60% of marriages taking place in Australia will be first marriages. The others will be second or third marriages. In fact, when you look at the marriage statistics, when you look at the divorce statistics, and at the number of young people who are postponing or avoiding marriage altogether, it's tempting to say marriage has gone out of fashion in Australia. But there is this significant minority of people for whom it's a high fashion activity, and they like to keep doing it. And so second and third marriages are no longer confined to Hollywood. You can find them in Beechworth. But why mention this? Well, obviously divorce is a major dislocation. And it's not just a dislocation for the couples who are splitting, or for their kids, for their extended families, but also for their friendship circles, for the community or communities that they belong to. The ripples from separation and divorce go out and often have a disruptive effect on communities. And of course, especially a disruptive effect on kids. There are currently 1 million dependent kids in Australia who are living with just one of their natural parents. Now that's getting close to a quarter of the child population. And that's a very significant social change. Almost 25% of families in Australia with dependent children are single-parent families. So that's a disruption for those kids, which of course in turn is more disruptive. It means we're raising a generation who are not living with the idea of marriage and family as necessarily permanent and stable, but institutions which are subject to constant review and evaluation. And if this is not working, you hear people say the relationship isn't working, we're out of here. And you hear their parents saying, what's all this talk about relationships? Aren't they married? They're married. Why don't they just get on with it? Well, there's been a huge generational shift in the view of what this institution is. Now, mentioning children, of course, leads to a second great social revolution in Australia, which is our plummeting birth rate. It's stopped plummeting, although it's actually started again. There was a brief period when the decline in the birth rate stopped. Some people were talking about a mini baby boom. It was certainly very mini. The birth rate staggered up from about 1.7 babies per woman to 1.8 or something. It was a pathetic rise, but it was due to the baby bonus. Thank you, Peter Costello. He said if we pay them to have more children, they will, and they did. The birth rate went up, particularly in lower socioeconomic strata, where the money meant a great deal. Well, we don't have that anymore, and the birth rate in the last 12 months has gone down again. The replacement level for maintaining the population, the replacement birth rate for maintaining the population at its current level is 2.1 babies per woman, but we're back down to about 1.7. So if it were not for immigration, we'd eventually shrink, perhaps fizzle out if we waited long enough. Now, why do I mention the low birth rate? Well, if you reflect on your own childhood, and perhaps if you're a parent, the time when your children were young, you recognise that kids are a crucial part of community development. That kids act like social lubricants. They get to know each other. A new family moves in, the kids get to know each other at school or playing in the park, and gradually their families get to know each other, and networks are often begun at the level of the children. So when we are in a situation like the one we're in at the moment, where Australia is producing, relative to total population, we're producing the smallest generation of children we have ever produced in our history, that means that social lubricant is in shorter supply than it's ever been. And so we have to compensate for that. It's interesting how we are compensating for it. If you want to amuse yourself, take a look at two graphs of Australia over the last 30 or 40 years. One is the falling birth rate, the other is the rising level of pet ownership. So one of the ways we're compensating for the absence of kids is to acquire, in particular, dogs. And so taking the kids to the park to play and where you meet the other parents has been replaced by taking the dogs to the dog walking park where the dogs can play and you meet the other dog owners. It's a process. It works for some people. I'm not sure it has quite the richness of interaction between kids. And of course it's been complicated by the fact that as more and more dogs are acquired as child substitutes, they're given human names. Have you noticed this? In fact, I recently was introduced to a dog called Ian, which for some reason that struck me as a strange name for a dog. And for some years I've known a dog called Wendy. So you go to the park, and unless you really know the owners well, it's always a bit of a struggle to remember whether Ian is the owner or the dog. Anyway, that's a compensation. Let me quickly run through some other factors that have been threatening, not destroying, but threatening the stability and cohesiveness of our communities. The rise of the two-income household, for all sorts of reasons, partly to do with the gender revolution, partly to do with our expectation of great material prosperity. We've decided that middle-class Australians need two incomes in order to maintain their standard of living. Well, that's fine. That's another subject. I won't get into the complexities of that, except just to observe that if you're in a two-income household, one of the features of that household is that you have less time and energy left over for being a neighbour. By the end of the week, you're both tired. You're probably on a shorter fuse than you might otherwise be. Your sense of humour may not be as robust as it once was, and you're catching up with domestic chores, fitting in, taking the kids to sport, if there are any kids, or taking the dog to the park, doing the shopping, doing all those things that might otherwise have been done during the week. And time spent with neighbours, just chatting to the neighbour, being part of the street, the life of the community, is a bit harder to find than it was. And I'm not arguing in favour of stay-at-home wives and mothers at all, but we just have to acknowledge that when most adults are working at least part-time, the health of the neighbourhood is put at risk by that. Here's another factor, and I think, to my mind, as a social researcher, probably the most significant of all the factors that have been reshaping Australia in this last 30 years or so, and that's the phenomenon of the shrinking household. Now, it's not a new phenomenon. If you look at the last 100 years of Australia, in that period our population has increased fivefold, the number of households has increased tenfold. So we've been growing households at twice the rate we've been growing the population. In other words, households have been shrinking. We've reached the stage where the average Australian household is now 2.5 people, where the single biggest household category, if you think of the categories as number of persons per household, the biggest single category is the single person household. If you put one-person and two-person households together, you now have well over half of all Australian households. So if you live alone or with just one other person, you are now mainstream in terms of Australian household statistics. We would not have to go back too far to a point where we would have said if you're living as a couple with your own children, that's mainstream. But now, if you're looking at a household that contains a man and a woman, I'm going to describe a very particular case, a man and a woman who are married to each other and have never been married to anyone else, and they are currently living with 3 or more of their own children and no one else's, they are now the eccentric fringe. Whereas we would once have said that's a mainstream Australian household. So the mainstream is the single person household or the two-person household. And of course there are lots of reasons why that's happened. Again, that's not the subject of this lecture, but there are lots of reasons why it's happened, and there are lots of consequences that flow from that. Obviously, one consequence is that the risk of loneliness is greatly heightened in a community where there are so many small and shrinking households. It doesn't mean that people who live alone are lonely, but it does mean that people who live alone are at greater risk of experiencing loneliness, which can easily morph into feelings of isolation and even alienation if you're spending too much time alone. And so again, we have to compensate for that. Another couple of graphs that tell the story, the decline in the number of persons per household and the dramatic increase in eating out, people going to coffee shops and cafes and food courts. Do you have a food court in Beechworth? I hope not. It's a sort of public trough. You've probably seen them in Melbourne. Well, people go to food courts and even to coffee shops and cafes as a way of grazing with the herd, really. Even if you don't feel like mooing, you're at least in the same paddock and you feel as if you're part of the human herd. So that's a compensation. But of course, the main compensation that's required for the problem of potential loneliness in shrinking households is action on the part of people who are not living alone, to make sure that those who are embraced by the life of the street and the community, and that someone is looking out for them and noticing if they haven't appeared for 2 or 3 days, or even for 1 day. Very quickly, a couple of other factors that have been driving this trend towards less stable, less cohesive communities. We've become a more mobile population. Australians now move house on average once every 6 years. If you've been living in the same house for 30 years, just imagine how often everyone else must be moving to get the national average up to once every 6 years. That's exactly the same as for America, by the way. And of course, we're increasingly mobile in the other obvious sense of car ownership being almost universal, and people coming and going increasingly by car. You wave at your neighbour's car, you assume your neighbour is at the wheel. It's not quite the same as running into your neighbour on the footpath or at the bus stop and exchanging a few words. And of course there's another factor which I'm sure some of you are thinking should have been at the top of the list, which is the information technology revolution. A curious revolution. It's brilliant, it's convenient, it's spectacular, it's the cleverest thing we've ever encountered in our lives, and it promises to bring us together in an unprecedented way. What it's actually doing is making it easier than ever for us to stay apart in an unprecedented way. So as long as we're prepared to text messages to each other or Facebook posts or tweets or Snapchats or whatever else you're doing, that's great. There's a kind of link, but it's nothing like this link. It's inconceivably different from the link that occurs when human beings get face-to-face in a personal conversation. Perhaps the most creative thing we humans ever do is synthesize all the complex factors that are involved when we're chatting to someone. You get words, you get a tone of voice, you get a rate of speech, you get a look on the face, you get a twinkle in the eye or an absence of a twinkle in the eye, you get posture, you get gestures, you get the ambience of the situation. It's very, very complicated. And all of those bits that I've just mentioned send messages which have to be synthesised. So if someone says, look, I'm not angry with you, you discount the words completely because the red face and the tone of voice says I'm angry. And you're also learning something strange about this person, that when they're angry, they say they're not. Better store that up. So we do all that, but of course that's all gone when we use information technology. All we get are the words. Maybe emoticons turn you on, but occasional pictures. I did receive, for the first time, just a couple of days ago, a picture of a meal that a friend was about to eat. You've probably had many of those. I was hoping I'd die before I got one of those, but anyway. So why mention this? Well, the fact is that the technology is so brilliant, so seductive, that it does tempt us to spend more time with the screen than we ever have before, and all of that time is spent at the expense of face-to-face time. I mean, the devisers of these various social media are very clever, aren't they? Talking about Facebook friends. I've got 5,000 Facebook friends. Well, you might have 5,000 Facebook contacts. You've probably got about 5 friends, like most of us. FaceTime we have on the Skype alternative. Well, yeah, it's FaceTime in a way, but it's nothing like face-to-face time in reality. So that's another pressure tending, not inevitably, but tending towards fragmentation and dislocation of communities. Well, let me stop that analysis and bring all this to a conclusion. The cumulative effect of what I'm saying is very obvious, that even in regional towns, but certainly in larger conurbations, the tendency of all of this that I've been describing is to make people feel a bit disconnected, a bit more thrown back on their own resources, a bit less likely to feel that they're connected, that they're belonging in a local community. And when that happens, we start to feel less comfortable and less trusting. And here's a chilling piece of research that I came across. A study conducted, national survey conducted by Edith Cowan University in Perth, in which they reported nationally that only 35% of Australians say they trust their neighbours. Now that does not, of course, mean that 65% of neighbours are untrustworthy. What it means is that to a disturbing extent, we don't know our neighbours well enough to know that we can trust them, because almost everyone is trustworthy and those who are not are certainly the exceptions. Well, we know that this is not the way we're meant to live. We're not meant to live in a state of anxiety or feeling as if we can't trust our neighbours. The way we're meant to live is as part of communities in which we fully acknowledge each other, look out for each other, and feel as though we belong to each other. One of my psychological heroes, the American psychotherapist Carl Rogers, towards the end of his life, reflecting on his work as a counsellor or psychotherapist, said that whenever any of his clients came to a full understanding of who they were, it was always to realise that they were part of something, that the sense of themselves in isolation was meaningless, that they belonged to a family or a work group or a friendship group or a drinking group or a neighbourhood, but it was the sense of social connectedness that defined them. And how true that is. Jude mentioned that in her introduction. Let me encourage all of you, while I'm encouraging you to abandon the pursuit of personal happiness, let me also encourage you to abandon the quest for an answer to the question, who am I? That is an enormous waste of time. And let me tell you, if you ever found the answer, you'd be disappointed because you would discover that you're just like the rest of us. What we have in common is far more significant than the differences between us. But it's the wrong question to ask because we're social creatures. The question is, who are we? So putting all of this together, obviously what I'm saying is beware. There are pressures on every community in the modern world under the conditions of our contemporary culture. There are pressures that would fragment us unless we are careful to resist them. Yes, local government does a brilliant job of providing the sort of infrastructure that encourages us to stay together. Parks, shopping precincts, walking trails, bike riding opportunities, all of these things where we're encouraged to get out and run into each other, coffee shops, to run into each other, to have incidental encounters, and that's good. And yes, there are lots of clubs and societies and associations, especially in a place like Beechworth, where we can join and we should join in order to not just engage, but to contribute so that the community is being nurtured. We do need to remember that as humans, it's natural for us to connect. If a Martian came and visited Earth and looked, perhaps not in Beechworth, but certainly in Melbourne and some other larger towns, looked at people in a lift or people standing at a bus stop, and someone said, oh, by the way, these are social creatures, the Martian would say, no, they're not. There are 3 or 4 people standing there together ignoring each other. That's not what social creatures do. Well, of course, it's not what social creatures do. But if you go to somewhere like Sydney, you find that avoiding eye contact has become an art form. It's very hard to engage people when you pass them in the street. I try it. I'm often carrying a clipboard, which is probably a worry. But we do have to remember that saying good day, remembering to make eye contact, remembering to greet people, especially if they're strangers, is the way we actually build social capital, is the way we actually nurture a community. The biggest factor, of course, in withstanding the pressure of all of these changes and the other factors that tend to dislocate us, the biggest factor is love. And I'm not talking about romance. I'm not even talking about an emotional state. When I say love, I'm talking about that remarkable human capacity for kindness, for compassion, for charity, for respect towards people who are utterly different from us, and particularly towards people who we don't even especially like. This is humans at their best. Humans who are capable of being loving in that sense, that non-emotional, non-romantic sense, carries them way beyond just being good citizens who obey the law, carries them way beyond people who are trying to follow some moral code. It takes them to a new realm of being in which love is like a motivation, it's like a mindset, it's like a mental discipline, it's a way of life. And that loving disposition which says, whoever you are, however much I dislike you, I'm going to treat you kindly, compassionately and with respect. It won't only transform you, it'll transform us. So the good news is that in spite of everything that's happening to work against communities, communities can thrive anywhere. I conducted some research a few years ago in the Sydney suburb of Mascot. I'm sure you're all familiar with Mascot, right by the perimeter of Sydney Airport. A pretty unprepossessing place, not many trees, bit of light industry mixed with residential streets and so on. And I was listening to a group of young mothers in Mascot saying, why would anyone ever want to live anywhere but Mascot? They simply couldn't imagine a better place to live because this was how they lived. They knew each other. They weren't best friends, but they were neighbours, and they were acting like neighbours, and that made them feel as though this was a place where they might belong. Why would we bother to master the art of belonging, let me conclude by stating there are 3 very good reasons for doing it. The first is that the reward for building and maintaining a strong community is that we will feel safer and more emotionally secure. It takes a village to raise a child, says the old African saying, and that's true not just of children, it's true of us. It takes a village, it takes a community, it takes our sense of belonging to an active community to keep us safe, secure, and probably sane as well. The second reason is, as any psychiatrist will tell you, that it's actually good for you to have accidental encounters with people in your neighbourhood, to stop for a chat. If you're interested in keeping dementia at bay, crosswords won't do it for you, unfortunately. If you enjoy crosswords, go ahead, but they'll have zero impact on the threat of dementia. What is most likely to keep dementia at bay is talking to people, having social interactions, especially unplanned social interactions where you have no idea in what direction the conversation might go. But the third reason, of course, is the way that we manage our relationships within our community determines not just the way our community will be, but determines the kind of society Australia will become. It's very easy to bleat about the state of the nation, the state of the world, what's becoming of Australia, what's happening to society, to communities, etc., etc. Very easy to forget that the state of the nation starts in our street. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Hugh will now take some questions. There are 2 roving mics. We ask that you give your name and ensure your questions are brief and, in fact, are a question. Remember, too, that we are recording today's proceedings. Look for questions. There's one over here. Thank you. Just looking for a microphone. Over here.
Hugh, thank you very much. I'm Richard Waits, with my local Rick Waits from Beechwood. Thank you. I was really interested in your comments about happiness, and I guess the happiness epidemic, this idea that we all have to be happy all the time. In response to a discussion about development in Bhutan some years ago, the King of Bhutan said, well, we're not interested in monitoring our national progress against gross domestic product, we're interested in gross national happiness.
Yes.
Interested in your idea about how we should be assessing or measuring our progress as a society in the context of this idea of the art of belonging. We measure according to easy economic indicators. We do have more complex indicators like well-being indicators, but how would you think we should be monitoring our progress as a society?
Yes, thanks, Rick. And the Bhutan example is now being followed by lots of other people around the world, governments and organisations. I wish they'd chosen some word other than happiness, because in fact it's their measure is a very good measure, but I wouldn't describe it as a measure of happiness. It's a measure of general community health and well-being, which is a different thing. So if I was looking, say in Beechworth, looking for a measure of how well we're doing, I'd be trying to assess the level of social isolation. The number of people year by year who feel socially isolated or even excluded. How long is it since you spoke to a neighbour? How long is it since you spoke to anyone? Those sort of things, I think, reveal a great... And, of course, on the positive side, how many organisations do you belong to? You know, when did you last attend some kind of community meeting or a church or a parent group or a sporting club or something? Those are, to me, the measures of the health of a community.
Good. Thank you for your lecture, Hugh. It was really great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. My name is Johannes Hengstmengel, which obviously is a more foreign type name, you might say. I was born in Holland, but I hope I'm a true blue Aussie now. My question is that we've just had an election. During that election, certain people have been elected who, well, let's say they are voicing an opinion to state that certain people aren't welcome in our community and shouldn't be in our community, and we maybe should have a royal commission about them. The whole community hears this message coming across from elected officials. How do we negate that? How do we stand up against it as a community? Because obviously we can't isolate certain people in our community, because if we do that, we are not a community anymore.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yes, and that's the answer. And of course, as far as Beechworth is concerned, or other communities represented in this audience, we've got to focus on making sure that we are not contaminated by any of this nonsense. Communities have to fight, and there have been some spectacular examples around Australia of communities who, in relation to refugees, for example, or Muslims or other groups that we've thought of as other, have been wonderfully welcoming. We are not helped at the moment, and you're talking about the One Nation phenomenon, of course, and the anti-Muslim message, which is an extraordinary message for a country like Australia. I mean, people assume that we're being overrun by Muslims. 2.2% of the Australian population identified as Muslim in the last census, compared with 61% identifying as Christian. The fastest growing religion in Australia is Hinduism, which will overtake both Buddhism and Islam in the lifetime of most of the people in this hall. That's already happened in New Zealand. So this is a tiny proportion of the population. If we can't accommodate them, make them feel welcome, etc., then this is a very black mark, which would join another very black mark, which is what we're doing to asylum seekers. So we're a funny society at the moment. We pride ourselves on all the qualities of the Australian way of life and the Australian character and so on, but you'd have to say, what are some of the features of the Australian character? Well, one feature is we lock people up in detention centres who have committed no crime, and we subject them to mental torture for an indeterminate period. That's what Australians do. That's not a nice thing to say about ourselves, but it's true. Now, when that sort of thing is going on, and when we have leaders on both two major sides of politics going on about border protection as though it's one of our great contemporary challenges, considering that there are something like 95 million refugees in the world, and a tiny, tiny number ever make it here. But when we have political rhetoric designed to keep us afraid, designed to make us feel insecure on the grounds that politicians are more likely to be re-elected, governments are more likely to be re-elected if people are feeling a bit spooked, let's not rock the boat, and it works around the world. But if you have that kind of rhetoric at the top, then it makes things like this less surprising. It makes it easier for people to say things that appeal to our rising sense of anxiety about, what's happening to our society. Are we being changed by all these strange refugees or these people with different religious backgrounds from ours? It's very easy when people are feeling insecure. It's very easy to encourage them to exaggerate what the threat is. So the answer for Beechworth is don't let it happen here. Stifle all this absurd talk about the threat and put it in proportion. How could it possibly be a threat? And in any case, we're talking about human beings. And of course, we're hearing examples of particular Muslims, especially young men who've gone off to fight with Islamic State and so on. How many? Does anyone know how many? About 8? Yeah. So let's not get carried away. Yes. Next question.
Thank you, Hugh. It's very reassuring to hear your points of view on the importance of community connectedness. I just wanted to touch on your comments about mental illness, though, and
Crosswords?
No, not crosswords. You talk about the happiness epidemic, and I get the feeling you're implying that there's been an increased rate of mental illness, and you mentioned anxiety in particular, which apparently 20% of the population do suffer with. And I feel like that's a very simplistic viewpoint, that anxiety is the opposite of happiness, and that it's because people are aspiring to some impossible view of happiness, and that's the reason that they're feeling stressed all of the time, or overwhelmed all of the time, or panicked. I'm curious, do you believe that...
I'm not saying that.
No, okay, I'll let you explain. But do you believe that there has been an increase in the rate of, the levels of mental illness as a result of a perception that we should be happier?
No, certainly that would be very simplistic, and I hope I wouldn't be guilty of that. There's certainly been an increase in the rate of mental illness. There's no question about that, or at least an increase in the rate of detected, reported mental illness. And when we hear things like 25% of Australian young people are likely to experience an episode of clinical depression before the age of 20, you have to say this is a worrying trend. What is the cause? There'll never be a single explanation. The explanations will be all the things I mentioned. Family dislocation, bleak employment prospects, too much time spent with a screen, over-expectation of happiness and positive outcome. There'll be, in any given case, we might come up with 12 contributing factors, and the happiness thing would only be one of them. I mentioned it only to say not only is it absurd for all the other reasons, but actually it increases the pressure on young people to feel as though they ought to be feeling positive and happy all the time. But never would I suggest that's the reason.
Yeah, hi, Greg Clydesdale. I talk a lot, so I'll try and keep it brief. You mentioned briefly the disruptive new technology, Facebook, etc., and yet the contradiction in that, in relation to how it ties communities together, is something that quite often you see Facebook communities. That's what they're called, and yet you're saying that they are at odds with the sort of historic connections that we have had. Is there enough data and information about how those new technologies and they do brand themselves as disruptive technologies? Yes, is there enough data about them to actually be making some social comment?
No, look, it's very good we're having these questions. So it gives me a chance to put a bit more nuance into this. Obviously, I didn't have time to develop it. No, look, I've got a chapter in my new book called The Art of Belonging about online communities, in which I quote a lot of the research. And the research is very contradictory. The revolution is still so new that you can find in the research almost anything you're looking for. But there does seem to be an emerging trend suggesting that people who spend, and I can't give you the number of hours, but people who spend excessive amounts of time per day with a screen, their social skills suffer, their relationships suffer, and curiously enough, their self-esteem is likely to suffer as well. So one of the effects of trawling through all your friends' Facebook posts is to think everyone else having a better time than I am. It's a bit like those circular letters that families sometimes send out at Christmas, saying, my 9-year-old grandson has just got his second PhD and his string quartet is going to be performed, etc. And it makes you think, gosh, we haven't done anything. So the social media are a bit like that. They're bragging media, particularly for kids. That's what they're about. They're for promotion of brand me. And this has a negative effect on people who spend too much time reading about everyone else's wonderful exploits. But it is a confused picture, and you're right to point it out. I mean, there are experts in the field. Now, I'm not an expert in this field, but there are experts in the field saying everything from, it's absolutely fine, it's a new form of tribalism, they're in touch 24/7, it's like the web of connectedness literally vibrates all the time, and isn't that fantastic? No one need ever feel alone again. All the way through to people like Susan Greenfield, the British neuroscientist, saying computers should be designed so they switch off every 30 minutes because their effect on our brains is too potentially damaging. So they're the two extremes. I think all I'd say is it's very obvious, and if you live in a regional community and you have an extended family all over the country or all around the world, then obviously Facebook, for example, or Skype, or these other things are a blessing for keeping in touch. But when we are sacrificing time spent with people who we could be seeing because we're physically close enough to see them, we're sacrificing that in favour of screen time, then that's a serious worry.
Yeah, hello Hugh, my name's James Houston. Hugh, I'm excited by how you're redefining how we belong by the concept of it is how we live with one another. And I'm excited by that prospect. Where you're standing 20 years ago is a place where I was seeking to belong. I existed through this place when it was a mental health institution and was searching to connect with people and to have a sense of belonging. And in that space, I felt communion with Aboriginal peoples and their art of belonging, which has much to do with a sense of connection to family and the land.
Yes.
So I'm intrigued on a couple of fronts. Why is it that you didn't make mention or discuss that today, that sense of belonging that Aboriginal peoples have? Then on the other hand, I'm excited by the prospect that you're inviting us to engage with our Aboriginal neighbours, if I'm to put it in that framework, so as we as a nation of peoples can have a sense of belonging, and that we as individuals can complete ourselves and overcome the fractured separation that exists within each. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah. Well, that's very eloquent, and I don't know that I need to say anything more except yes, absolutely. That's what I'm suggesting. And I do acknowledge, I mean, I didn't mention Indigenous culture at all. There's a lot of things I didn't mention, but you're absolutely right to point out that if we're looking for an example of a culture that's absolutely committed to the idea that we are all one, that you can't separate me from my ancestors and from my contemporaries, there's no better example on the planet than Australian Aboriginal culture. And if you're looking for the way to integrate our sense of shared place with our sense of shared identity, again, that's the brightest example there is. I think just back to this point about who am I? I mean, we can learn from Indigenous cultures here and in other parts of the world that you don't discover who you are by looking in the mirror. You discover who you are by looking into the faces of the people who love you, or the people you're related to, or at least the people who are prepared to put up with you. That's who you are, because that's where you belong.
Hi, my name's Jenny. I've recently moved from Brunswick to Beechworth, and I've got a more philosophical question about your concept of love. I'm just really interested in the place that empathy plays in your concept of love.
Enmity?
Empathy.
Oh, empathy, sorry.
Empathy.
Right.
Empathy.
That's a bit less complicated than I thought it was going to be.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, yes. Well, a crucial place. When I was redefining love, not redefining, I mean, there are many, many meanings of love. I love the dog, I love lunch, I love Beechworth, I love my family. These are all very different meanings. But the meaning that I was focusing on, which is relevant to the task of creating a community where we can all feel we belong, I wanted to emphasise this is a non-romantic, non-emotional thing. It's a mindset that we can develop by simply deciding and practising, rehearsing, trying it out. We can actually be kind, we can be compassionate, and a crucial part of the process is to learn the art of empathy as well. So part of what makes us good citizens, part of what makes us good members of a functioning community is that we can actually imagine what it's like to be those other people. Like the man who asked the question, we can imagine, or we can try to imagine what it must have been like to go through the experience that he described in this place. Until you're prepared to try to imagine what it's like for the other person, empathy, it's a bit hard to put into practice the ideas of compassion, kindness, respect, etc. But when people have insights about all this sort of stuff, they are usually along the lines of, it suddenly occurred to me that we are actually all one. We are all just threads in the one tapestry, so it would be crazy to treat other people with anything but respect and kindness, because they're me. We're all it. We're all in this thing together. One last question, yes.
Bernard Bullen, as you've mentioned, it's very easy to see Beechworth as a community, if that's what I want to choose to see, and develop in that. But in the world of Facebook, in the world of television, jumping on a plane, flying around the world, people moving a lot more than they used to move, it's difficult to see that the idea of which community am I a part of it all sounds very nice, but you can see how religions and how nationalism starts to go. Brexit in Britain, whatever the cost, let's get out of there. It is genuinely becoming not an attitudinal thing, but a real thing, that the world is becoming much more of a melting pot, and there are dangers in overstating your identification with a particular group, would you not think?
Look, it is true that everything you've just said is true. It's becoming, the world is shrinking. We still haven't got the so-called global village. A village is a place where you run into people and say good day. Well, that's not true of people in other countries, even if we're encountering them on Facebook. But it is true that we travel more, we move more, we're much younger people and much more flexible about where they're going to work, who they're going to marry, where they're going to live, etc. It's all much more globalised than it used to be. That's very true. However, it seems to me that if we think that takes us away from our moorings, where our moorings are a community that we feel we're anchored in, where we absolutely belong, then I think that is bad for our mental health. We do need the sense of a stable, cohesive community that we are part of. And by the way, whenever there's a crisis, we discover what that is. Beechworth discovered it with fires recently, a bushfire and a supermarket fire. Suddenly you know what the community is, because these are the people who rush around and help out. That's your community. They're not flying in from all over the world to help out. It's us. It's this community. And so that's, I think the local community is always precious, is always special. We have all these, most of us belong to lots of communities, including online communities. But let's not forget that the most precious community we belong to is the local neighbourhood, because when we're in a jam, that's all we've got. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugh. I now invite Richard Power, Chair of WAW Credit Union, to thank Hugh. And I also would like to acknowledge that this is the 10th year that WAW has sponsored the Kerferd Oration. Richard Power.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege and pleasure to thank Mr Mackay for giving the 2016 Kerferd Oration. Mr Mackay's gift to us today is to ask us to think about what makes a healthy community. Intuitively, I think we recognise the value of belonging to a community, but the conscious step we have to take, inevitably and collectively, is that what we decide to support our community by our actions and our deeds. In this way, we become the community, and the community is what we make of it. I'd like to ask you all, please, if you would, give a round of applause to thank Mr Mackay for his presentation. This is the 10th year WAW Credit Union has sponsored the Kerferd Oration, and I thank the Oration Committee for giving me the opportunity to address you. WAW is a tremendous supporter of this community event, as are other sponsors such as La Trobe University, Indigo Shire and Quercus Beechworth, formerly known as the Beechworth Neighbourhood Centre. WAW looks forward to continuing this support into the future. The acronym WAW stands for Wangaratta Albury Wodonga, and many of you here will know that WAW Credit Union is part of the community in this region. Our origins date back to the Bandiana Credit Union, which was formed in 1956 by Defence Department employees at the Bandiana base. 7 separate regional organisations have combined over the years to become what is WAW today. Most of our 20,000 owners and more than 30,000 customers live, work or operate in northeast Victoria or southern New South Wales. Part of WAW's history is the Beechworth Credit Cooperative Society, formed in 1971 by staff of the Mayday Hills Hospital. In 1979, the Cam Street office was built by what had become the Beechworth and Ovens Credit Union. In 1989, this credit union merged with WAW, and the Cam Street building had been sold in 1986, and later in 2011 WAW was able to buy it back and do some renovations to make it a better building and fit to the historic Beechworth streetscape. Today WAW is a modern banking institution holding the same banking licences as the 4 big banks. Our cooperative model means that we return profit to our customers through lower fees and good interest rates. We are also able to give back to our community. In the last financial year, we supported approximately 190 community groups with payments totalling $100,000. In addition, WAW's charity, Latipso, has donated approximately $1.5 million to local hospitals over the last 12 years. This ranges from hospitals as far northeast as Walmer and Corryong down to Wangaratta. WAW also employs 80 people, operating 13 service centres within these regions. WAW is an organisation that has a strong commitment to making this region a great place to live, work and play. We belong to this community, and today we have it on display over here, some of the original historical documents for the Beechworth Credit Union, and they can be cited over here at the entrance. just before I close, I would like to pick up on something that Mr Mackay said, that he spoke about cooperativeness in the communities. Well, I'm proud to say that WAW is all of those. We are a cooperative and we provide a community-based financial facility for our members and the community. Well, I'd like to finalise things by saying we are very grateful, Mr Mackay, for sharing your wisdom and your vision. And I'd ask you all here to please once again express your appreciation in the usual manner. Thank you.
We now come to the Kerferd Medal presentation. George Kerferd and his wife Anne Nee Martindale had 10 children. Present are 2 grandsons, Robert Kirkwood, descended from Joseph 1871 to 1952, and his wife Sue, and granddaughters Nicole Kirkwood and great-grandson London, and Ian Young, descended from Frederick 1872 to 1957, and his wife Julie. The George Briscoe Kerferd Medal was crafted by George Frimmel of Melbourne and has an image adapted from an 1870 print that's in the Burke Museum collection. Representing the Kerferd family, I invite Ian Young to present the George Briscoe Kerferd Medal to Hugh Mackay.
Thank you, and yes, my name is Ian, but I'm not going to be barking at you today. Although I am happy to stand up on my hind feet next to the painting of my great-grandfather, if anybody wants to take a photo with or without dog food. But I just want to quickly say I just love the Kerferd orators because they say it, they don't hold back, and they give us so much to think about. And Hugh, you've carried on that fine tradition, so thank you. And I just was amazed how well you know George Briscoe Kerferd, even if you don't realise it, because you summed up his working life in your latest book, Beyond Belief, perfectly. If I could just quote page 250, a paragraph from page 250 from Beyond Belief, you say, to test whether you are engaging with your compassionate mind is easy enough to apply. For example, if you were a politician, you would embrace the spirit of loving kindness in your dealings with your political opponents, treating them with respect and restraint, forgiving them their personal frailties and shortcomings, being unflinchingly resistant to the use of slur and innuendo, and confining the heat of debate to policy issues, unquote. Sums up George Kerford's working life totally. Just spot on, and that's just not my opinion, because when George Kerferd retired from politics to become a Supreme Court judge, a paper back in January 1886, the Australian Sketcher, said about Mr Kerferd, and I quote, "Throughout his parliamentary career, he continued the policy of avoiding personalities in debate, and he has left the political arena without having offended any of his opponents or made enemies of them." So you was just spot on, thank you. So on behalf of everyone here today, and on behalf of the Kerferd family, it gives me great pleasure to give you something that only 13 other Australians are entitled to have. The George Briscoe Kerferd Oration Medal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you, Robert and Sue, Ian and Julie, Nicole and London for being here this morning. And to those members of the Kerferd family who have been unable to attend the Kerferd Oration this year. It is important that the name of the Kerfords live on to inspire in us great citizenship. The Honour Board shows the eminent speakers since 2003. Today is added the name of Hugh Mackay. On your behalf, I would like to thank all the people involved in the creation of this year's oration. They are listed on your program. Also, a special thanks to the three major financial sponsors, La Trobe University, WAW Credit Union and Indigo Shire Council. The Kerferd Oration Committee is delighted to announce that La Trobe University has agreed to continue their financial sponsorship of the Kerferd Oration for the next 3 years. We thank the George Kerferd Hotel, who so generously support the Kerferd Oration and have provided today's lunch. The Kerferd Oration Committee is interested in your thoughts about the oration, so I invite you to write your comments on the feedback survey that comes with your program. If you would like to join the Kerferd Oration Committee, please add your contact details and place all cards placed in the marked box near the main door as you leave. When speaking about his new book, Beyond Belief, Hugh said, "When you write a book, the experience always changes you, and this book has changed me more than others. The main change is now that I am not remotely interested in what you believe. I'm not dismissing your beliefs. I respect them, but I'm not interested. All I'm interested in is what you are doing to make the world a better place." Now there's a challenge for us all. In response to this challenge, Quercus Beechworth, who is a key supporter of the Kerferd Oration, will be inviting you all to get to know your neighbours on Sunday afternoon, the 27th of November. You might want to organise a street party, a game of cricket, a barbecue, afternoon tea, or just say good day over the back fence. A creative visual installation will be a key lead-in activity which will invite you to become engaged and to participate. Follow-up activities are being planned that will encourage school children to think about the value of knowing their neighbours, and you will be able to post photos of the event on Facebook and the Quercus website. And as happens now, up there on Fletcher Hill, participants will also be encouraged to develop an updated emergency list with their neighbours in preparation for the forthcoming fire season. Let's make the Connecting Beechworth Neighbourhood Day an annual event, but let's not wait until next year to continue to connect with our neighbours. And in the meantime, what will each one of us do, big or small, to make Indigo Shire a more connected community, the sort of community that reflects the way in which each one of us would wish to live? As we draw close to the 14th George Briscoe Kerferd Oration, please join us in sharing together a community lunch that will be served at the back of the room. However, in true neighbourly fashion and in true community spirit, we're going to have to ask those of you who are sitting at the back of the room to pack up your seats to make room for lunch to be served and for people and neighbours to get to know each other. Thank you very, very much and enjoy lunch.